Here are 13 mixing tips I wish I'd known sooner, and I wish someone had told me a few years ago because it would have saved me a lot of time and effort. Tip number 1 is the 10 out of 10 rule. And the idea here is that you'll never be able to take a mix that's a 5 out of 10 when you start mixing to a 10 out of 10. And you'll definitely never be able to take a 2 out of 10 to even an 8 out of 10. If you want to get to 10 out of 10, the rule is that you need to start with a mix that's already at 7 or 8 out of 10 when you start the process. And if you watch any mixer load up a Grammy-winning mix, and there's some videos here on YouTube where you can do that, you always notice that straight away they just bring up the faders and it already sounds great. And it almost makes you think, wow, what are they even doing? Are they even changing anything, or are they just getting sent these incredible multi-tracks and now everyone thinks they're this incredible mixer? But there's some really important things that we can learn from this. First of all, focus on production. Make sure that when you get to the start of the mix, it's already the best it can be. And then when you start the mixing process, remember that you can only take it so much further, and that'll take a lot of pressure off. And I hear from a lot of people, especially when they start out, that it takes them 10, 15 hours or longer to mix a track, or maybe even days and days and days, or maybe it just never even finishes. And I think it's because they're trying to take something that's a 2 out of 10 and make it a 10 out of 10. It's just not going to happen. Let me jump into my DAW and show you a really good example of this. So I've got a track here called A Reason to Leave by a band called Ghostly Beard. I got this from the Cambridge multi-track library, which is an incredible resource if you want multi-tracks to practice mixing with or anything like that. And so far, all that's happened in this mix is some mix prep. So I'll go through and I'll actually do a lot of the dynamic processing on the lead vocal before I even start mixing. So we've got vocal rider, de-essing, a bit of clipping, a bit of compression, a bit of limiting, because I know I'm going to want this locked in. So I don't really need the context of the mix. And I want to do as much as possible in the mix prep phase before I actually start mixing. And then Gullfoss, which is kind of just an absolute magic plugin that just makes everything sound better. On the backing vocals, I've just got Gullfoss, some gain staging, and here I've just got some amp simulation on the bass because it was just a DI'd bass, and more gain staging, and a tiny bit of limiting on the keys, again, just to catch those peaks. Don't really need the context of the mix to do that. And then finally, nothing on the output or the mix bus. These are just plugins from my templates that they're ready to go when I need them. And then I've done a volume balance and some panning. So pretty much this is just the volume balance. Have a listen.
Give me a reason to leave, babe. Just give me a reason to leave. Give me a reason.
So it's sounding pretty good already. There's still, a lot of top end needs to be added. There's a lot of dynamic inconsistencies. The guitar tone kind of sucks, to be honest. So there's still a bunch of problems that need fixing. And I just want to add way more energy to that chorus. But it's, a lot of the way there, and that's just with mix prep and volume balancing. Tip number 2 is to make a distinction between the objective and the subjective sides of music production. So we can actually break the entire music production process down into 2 different parts. Most people see it as one thing, but there's actually the objective, left brain, technical, scientific side of music production, which is understanding frequencies, volume, dynamics, the technicalities of how an EQ works, a compressor works, all the kind of engineering, sciencey stuff. And then there's the right brain, creative, emotional, and intuitive side of music and music production. When it comes to mixing, we're interfacing between those 2 things, more so than any other phase in the production process. When we're songwriting and even when we get into producing, we're spending a lot of time in that kind of right brain creative space, the subjective. When we're mastering, we're spending pretty much all of our time in the objective space, the technical, making sure that it actually ticks the sonic boxes. The mixing process, we're kind of between the 2, and we're using a lot of objective tools and terminology and knowledge of the science of audio and waveforms and how it works, but we're combining that with a lot of creative processes around using effects creatively, changing the nature of the song by highlighting certain aspects, enhancing the emotion and the feel and the artistic intent of the song by using automation. There's loads of ways that we interact with the creative side of music production when we're mixing. And I think it really helps to separate those 2 things out. Start by learning the technical, so you've got an understanding of the objective side of music production, so that then when you're being creative and you're in that state of flow, you're not getting interrupted thinking, okay, well, here's what I want to do, but I don't really know how a compressor works, and then thinking about the different controls on a compressor rather than just following through on your artistic intent. Or you want to achieve a certain effect on the vocal and make it sound really spacey, but you don't really know how to do that, and you're wondering how reverb works and which type of reverb should I use. And all of these things pull you out of that creative process. So you want to get mastery of the technical, kind of like soloing on an instrument. You're not actually thinking about the scales, but they're under your fingers, and you've got the technical side down, you've got the theory down, so that you can just focus on performing. Tip number 3 is that you can't derive an ought from an is. So now that we've made the distinction between the objective and subjective side of music production, we need to look at the relationship between those two things. And I'm stealing terminology here from a Scottish philosopher called David Hume, who said you can't derive an ought from an is. And what he meant by that is if we explain the state of the world and we say a tree is green, generally, then we can't say, therefore you ought to cut trees down. There is no way to actually derive an ought. You ought to do something, you must, you need to, you have to do something from the state of things as they are. They're disconnected. And of course, he was talking about moral philosophy and a bunch of other stuff. But we can take this and apply it to music production in the exact same way. If you have a snare that is very prominent around 2 kilohertz, let's say, that is a fact. You can look at it, you can look at a frequency analyzer, you can see that it's got a lot of energy around 2 kilohertz. That's the way things are. What you then do with that is totally subjective. Nobody can tell you, therefore you ought to cut 2 kilohertz. Based on what? The only thing you can do is you can say, if your goal is to achieve X, let's say if your goal is to free up some space around the 2 kilohertz region for the vocal, then you should probably cut 2 kilohertz in the snare. And even then it's, it's not you should absolutely cut 2 kilohertz in the snare, because maybe that creates other issues in the mix. So there are no rules, there are no musts, oughts, shoulds, have tos. You can only prescribe things to do based on a goal. Okay, with that all being said, it's extremely overwhelming to know that and think, okay, well then what the hell do I do? If I haven't been doing this for long, and even if I have a basic understanding of the objective side, how do I know what the hell to do? How do I take that knowledge of the science of audio and translate that into art and decide what decisions to make in the mixing process? I have a few tips for you there that can help you actually decide what you want to do when you're mixing. The first one when you're starting out is mostly just using references. And by pulling in references, you're pulling in an example of generally what other people think sounds good. And we can't say it's objectively good or bad, but we can say this is preferable to a lot of people. A lot of people like the way this sounds. So I can use that as a new measuring stick that can give me a dose of objectivity so that I can measure my mix against that and have some kind of a goal to work towards. Another approach is to almost do the complete opposite, and instead of trying to get some objectivity, just lean into the subjective nature of the mixing process and instead use your emotions as the guide. So this is where it starts to get a little bit abstract, so I'm going to jump into my DAW here and actually show you. Now, before we can use our emotions as kind of a guiding principle, we need to actually decide, what is this song about? How does it make me feel? What emotion do I want to enhance? What emotion is already there? What is the artistic intent? Do I want to enhance that, or do I want to bring in some different kind of emotions? Let's have a listen first and then I'll explain how it makes me feel. It's kind of makes me feel a bit cheeky. It's kind of sexy, and then the energy picks up. Still kind of got this like laid back, sultry vibe. But I don't know, I want to give that chorus more punch. I want it to come in and I want to feel like, it just feels cool, like it gives me kind of energy. That first hit definitely needs a bit more oomph as well. I'll probably also make that. But for now, let's look at some mix bus compression, because that's a really easy way to add quite a bit of energy to the whole mix, and we can make it sound punchier, and it should be a really easy thing for you to hear as well here in this video. So I'm going to use the API 2500. I normally use the SSLG bus, but this has got a bit more bite to it. So let's just turn this on and see how it changes the energy. This is without. When this lights up, it's on. So you can hear it's just adding punch, which makes it sound like the drummer's hitting the drums more aggressively. And we're getting, a very small amount of pumping and just rhythmically enhancing it as well. It just makes the whole thing sound a lot more aggressive, which is what I want. I want to give this chorus more of a lift, because to me it sounds a little bit too chilled and a little bit too relaxed. I want it to be a bit more climactic. So in terms of tweaking the settings here, if we went for a really fast attack time, bring up the threshold so you can really hear this. Kind of has the opposite effect.
Give me a reason to leave, babe. Just give me a
Adding energy for sure,
reason to leave.
but it's thickening out the sound
Give me
compared to a slower attack time.
to leave, babe. Just give me a reason to leave.
If you focus on the transient of the kick and the snare,
Give me a reason to leave, babe. Just give me a reason to leave.
we just get energy in different places. Fast attack time, it's giving us more energy in the snare and the cymbals, and the hi-hat in this case. Slow attack time gives us more punch and energy in the kick and the snare.
To leave, babe. Just give me a reason.
Let's dial this in to kind of a sweet spot in between.
Give me a reason to leave, babe. Just give me a reason.
I like it around there.
Give me a reason to
We can
leave,
bring the threshold back down.
babe. Just give me a reason to leave. Give me a reason to leave, babe. Just give me a reason to live. Give me a reason.
And there we go. So this should give us a bit more of a lift going into that chorus now.
It's aching in my heart. It's more than I can bear. Give me a reason to leave.
Definitely feel that more. It's enhanced the emotion that I want to bring out. It's not a particularly complex emotion, just more energy, a bit more gusto.
To leave, babe.
But to me, that really enhances the artistic intent of the track.
Reason to live.
So that's just one example. Lots of decisions like that where you're really thinking about the emotion, what emotion do I want to enhance? It can have a huge, huge impact on the eventual mix once you stack up lots of small decisions like that. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention when it comes to figuring out what to actually do in the mixing process, if there is no, ought, should, there are no rules, and that's taste. And over time, as you listen to more references, as you mix more and more songs, as you produce more and more music, just like songwriter or anything else, you develop your own taste. And taste is basically just what you like and what you don't like. So you'll get an idea for, I really like these snare sounds, I really like this type of sound in this type of genre, or I really don't like this, and that taste will kind of become your own sound as a producer or as a mixer. Once you start to develop that, you don't really have to lean on references as much. You kind of have this internal reference that you've developed over years and lots and lots of mixes, and then that starts to guide every little decision you make. So there is no right and wrong, but you'll still have your preferences for how you want to mix the sound. Tip number 4 is to always consider context when you're learning from somebody about mixing or about anything really, because there's a lot of differing advice about mixing online. You go on YouTube, you watch a bunch of videos, you'll very quickly see that everyone's saying something totally different, and some people say you need to do this, this is a rule, other people say the complete opposite, or people just express their opinion, but their opinions are also the complete opposite, and it can leave you really overwhelmed and perplexed as to, okay, well, what is actually the right thing to do? Well, there are a few reasons why this happens. First of all, people are focusing on that more subjective side, so you do get a lot of different opinions. If we're talking about how sound works and how waveforms work, we can't really have different opinions. That's the objective, that's the factual scientific stuff. But when we're talking about how to use EQ to make something sound different, well, that's highly subjective. Or if we want to say, how do we make a vocal sound better with EQ? Again, better is a very, very subjective term. So there's naturally a lot of disagreement. But there's two more reasons why everyone says something different. First of all is that a lot of different people specialize in different genres. So if you listen to a mix engineer who focuses a lot more on classical or jazz music, they're going to have very, very different opinions to a mix engineer who focuses a lot more on metal or harder rock music. And again, if you listen to someone who mixes a lot of electronic music, they're going to say something completely different. So you have to just really consider that context when you're listening to someone. Either find people who do generally work in the same genre as you, or find people who talk about multiple genres, or just apply that filter when you're listening to someone and think, okay, cool, they're saying this, they're saying I need to be really aggressive with compression. Well, what genre are they mixing? Okay, that's probably why. Does that apply to me? In what ways does that apply to me? How How does it not? How does it? Just ask those questions and consider the context. And then the other thing is skill level. The things that you need to be paying attention to, or the way you think about things as a beginner, is very different to the way you think about things as an intermediate or advanced mixer. And if you went straight in with the more advanced mindsets, it might put you on the wrong path, or it might just confuse you and make it more difficult than it needs to be. I actually remember an example from when I was at school where somebody challenged our physics teacher and said, this is completely different to what you told us a couple of years ago. And their response was, yes, that's true, but if we tried to teach you the absolute kind of advanced, truthful version of physics when you're only 12 years old, it's probably going to overwhelm you. So you have to kind of dumb things down a little bit. And then that enables people to get to that next level. And then once they get to that next level, you say, okay, well, you know that thing that I told you about? That's not 100% true. I had to dumb it down a bit. It's actually more nuanced than that. Here's situations where it's different. Here's how what I told you isn't true. And here's the actual truth that's a lot more complex. It's a process. So that's just another reason why there tends to be a lot of disagreement about how to approach the mixing process. Tip number 5 is to train your ears. I'm going to keep this brief because this isn't a new idea, but it's so important. And it's kind of the equivalent of just playing scales for an instrument. It's something you need to be doing every single day if you want to get good at mixing. And I recommend using Sound Gym for this. It makes it super easy. You want to just get in, do it every single day. It's going to help so much. It's boring, I know, but trust me, it will work. And I've seen so many cases where students have been absolutely transformed by this process of just using Sound Gym. It has a direct correlation with the improvement in the quality of their mixes. Tip number 6 is to practice critical listening. So as well as training your ears to identify different frequencies and differences in volume, which is kind of the objective side of developing your hearing and your listening, there's also the subjective side of critically analyzing music and using that ability to discern frequencies and discern volume differences and all that kind of stuff, and actually apply it to music and break down music that you like and music that you listen to. And then this is where we also cross over into just music theory and analyzing music and breaking down the songwriting, the arrangement, the emotion of music, and bringing that knowledge and that awareness into the mixing process. And the question I want you to ask yourself is, what am I hearing? That's kind of the core question that this all revolves around. The more you ask that question, what am I hearing, the better you'll get at discerning differences in mixes, differences in music, and breaking down and kind of reverse engineering the sound that you want to get. Even in your own mix, actually ask, okay, when I turn on this plugin, what am I hearing? What's changed? And then bypass the plugin. Okay. And then on an objective level, how does that affect the mix and the frequency response, the dynamics and the volume of the mix? And then on a subjective level, how does this make me feel different when I engage this plugin versus turn it off? And we can go a level deeper. We can even analyze specific areas. Either we could just listen to the whole mix and focus on, okay, well, how did the lower mid sound different? How did the upper mid sound different? Tip number 7 is to master the fundamentals. And I'm not going to spend too long on this because I think a lot of people talk about this, but it's really important to master the fundamentals and just stay on the fundamentals. And it gets boring. And I know that's part of the problem, just like with ear training. But if you just get really good at volume balancing, if you get really good at EQ, compression / limiting, saturation, reverb, delay, they're really the only 5 things. If you understand those 5 things in detail and you experiment with them a lot and you sit down and you play around with compression on different things and you see how it sounds and how it manipulates the sound, you combine that with critical listening, but you also get a good understanding of what the different parameters do. And you also get really good at just volume balancing, and you spend a lot of time volume balancing every single mix. These are the things that actually get you to that intermediate, advanced, professional level. It's doing these things really, really well, as opposed to learning a bunch of advanced tips and tricks. Tip number 8 is to focus on getting reps. And you need to take everything that I've explained so far and just put it into practice and get as many reps under your belt as you can. Honestly, I think this is the main issue holding most people back, and the main reason why a lot of people struggle is they just haven't put in the reps. They haven't put in the work. It's really that simple. And a lot of people seem to think the thing that's missing, if they can't quite achieve the sound in their head, or they're struggling to bridge that gap between kind of beginner and intermediate, they're stuck at that intermediate plateau, they think they need new knowledge and new information. And while sometimes that's true, a lot of the time they actually just need more practice. They've watched enough YouTube videos to know what they should be doing, and they have a very good theoretical understanding of mixing, but they haven't applied it enough, and they haven't actually just gone through the process enough times to figure out, you know, what's relevant, what's irrelevant, and kind of sift through all of that information that's just rattling around in their brain and actually put it into practice. First of all, internalize it, but also just learn through repetition and learn by actually doing the thing. And I would set a challenge for you to set a goal of how many mixes you want to do in a certain time frame and then stick to it. For example, if you said to yourself, okay, I'm going to do 100 mixes in the next 3 months, roughly 1 mix a day. And you don't have to do a really long mix. It could just be a quick kind of 2-3 hour mix. How much do you think that would help you improve? It's pretty clear that you would improve a lot without any new information, just by learning, by doing. You just have to do the work at the end of the day. You have to have the discipline to not be lazy, actually get home at the end of a work day or on the weekend, go into your studio or just open up your laptop and your headphones, whatever your setup is, and just mix. And if you want lots of material to practice on, check out the Cambridge Multitracks library. There's easily over 100 tracks there that you could mix. And then when it comes to mixing your own music, if you're doing that, it's going to be way easier because you've practiced, you've honed your craft on lots of music. And then when it comes to your own stuff, you're just way better, rather than only ever mixing your own music, which is going to put a serious limit on the volume that you can get under your belt. Tip number 9 is to close your eyes. And I mean this literally. When you're mixing, close your eyes. I do it all the time. If I want to compare a plugin, let's say I apply some EQ and I want to listen to it before and I want to listen to it after, I want to compare, see if I've made it sound the way I want it to sound, how it actually sounds different. Again, I ask myself those questions. What am I hearing? What are the differences here? I'll close my eyes and I'll leave my mouse over the bypass button and I'll click it. And sometimes I even click it a random number of times, so I don't even know if it's bypassed or not. And then I just listen with my eyes closed. And it becomes so much easier to actually hear the difference, but also it means that you're not getting tricked by what's on the screen, because if you're seeing charts moving or you're seeing the frequency curve, it totally affects how you hear things. And it's really difficult to actually separate that and not have that visual aspect influence the way you're hearing it. So the easiest way to get rid of that is just close your eyes. I do it all the time. Really simple thing, but really helps. Tip number 10 is to use references. I'm not going to go into this too much, again, because there's plenty of videos out there on this, but using references is absolutely vital. If you're not doing it already, it's going to make your life so much easier. In my opinion, if you're a beginner, you can lean a lot more heavily on references. And I can specifically remember my learning journey and when I started using references, and it was a huge kind of breakthrough in my progress. And when I started out, I was doing the bad thing of copying. I was actually trying to replicate my references perfectly. And you don't want to do that in the long run, but there is something there that's really helpful, because in that process of trying to replicate music, you learn a lot about how to reverse engineer it and then manipulate your mix to sound the same. So while you don't want to copy your references in the long run, as a beginner, I actually find it really helped me personally to use references a lot, really aggressively, constantly check back, find a reference track that sounded really close to mine and try to replicate it as an exercise. But then as you get more intermediate, more advanced, you want to reference less and less. And instead it should just be kind of checking every now and then, maybe at the beginning, halfway, at the end of your mix, and just listening to multiple tracks, 3 to 5, and just getting a vibe of, okay, well, there's significant problems. Have I got massively way too much low end, or have I got massively way too much top end, or what's going on in the lower mids, the upper mid range. Tip number 11 is to mix fast. And to help you do this, you can just use a timer and give yourself 3 hours, 4 hours to mix a track from start to finish. The exact length is of course going to depend on how many channels there are. If you've got like an 8-channel mix where it's like a live recording or rock band, that's going to take a lot less time to mix than a 50-channel electronic track where you've got stuff all over the place that you need to try and reconcile. So you factor that in, but mix fast, be intentional and think, okay, well, what are the actual things that I need to do in this mix to at least get it to the best possible that I can for this mix? How do I get this from a 4 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10? What are the major problems I need to solve in order to do that? It's just going to force you to be more intentional about everything, and that's really, really helpful. So many people who I speak to say, I really struggle with how long my mixes take. It takes me 15 hours to mix a track. And the issue isn't that they need to get that time down by fixing their process. The issue is they just need to set a constraint, 4 hours, and do it. Of course, as you get better, you get quicker with a lot of these things, and when you're a beginner, every little thing takes longer, but that's fine. Just accept that it's going to take you the same amount of time to get a 4 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10 than it would take a professional mixer to get from a 4 out of 10 to, let's say, a 7 or an 8 out of 10. But the way you get to that level is by repeating the process again and again and again, as opposed to trying to get one mix perfect. It's doing lots and lots of imperfect mixes. Tip number 12 is that any workflow works. There's a bunch of different workflows you can use. In the past, I've spoken a lot about top-down mixing. A lot of people like to start with the vocals. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. All of them work fine. What I actually tend to do now is just bring up the faders, get a volume balance going, and then just see what problems grab my attention and just start solving issues. If after I've got the volume balance done, the vocal is really bugging me, which is what happened in that mix you saw earlier, I'll go in and I'll mix the vocal first, and then I'll see what grabs my attention next, because normally the things that grab my attention are the biggest problems. And if I feel stuck and I'm not sure, or I don't really know where to go next, I'll go and have a break, come back and listen. It normally becomes obvious, or I'll listen through a bunch of reference tracks and that'll kind of give me some ideas. Or I'll start to cycle through and I'll think, okay, let me go through and kind of break this down, chunk it down, like how's the kick drum, how's the snare, and I'll kind of go through things one by one. But more often than not, it's just obvious and you just kind of work through the mix, solving one thing at a time until you get to the end of your timer, go have a break, come back, repeat that process, for another half hour, have a break, repeat it for half an hour, and then the mix is basically done. And finally, tip number 13 is to ask the right question. So this is kind of a philosophical one. And we've done a bit of this already with the critical listening tip, where I kind of explained that you want to ask, what am I hearing? Or how does it make me feel? Asking the right questions is how you get the right answers. So I want to run through some questions here that you should be asking yourself when you're just listening to music, but also when you're mixing. And it'll really help you be more intentional and a lot more focused with how you're approaching the mixing process. Question number 1, we already spoke about, which is, what am I hearing? Question number 2 is, how does it make me feel? Question number 3 is, what needs fixing? Question number 4 is, what emotional aspects can I enhance? And question number 5 is, why am I doing this? And if you answer those first 4 questions, the questions that might already be obvious. But anytime you load up a plugin or you decide to do something in the mix, you need to ask, okay, why am I doing this? What am I actually trying to achieve? What am I trying to fix? What am I trying to enhance? It will force you to have a clear intent when you're doing anything in the mix. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, even if you take those 13 things, there's still obviously a lot more that goes into the mixing process. And this has all been quite abstract and philosophical, but there are, of course, lots of kind of more tactical tips and tricks that you can implement in your mixes. And while none of those mixing tips or tricks in isolation are going to help you take your mixes to the next level, they can be useful in just kind of chipping away and eventually getting to that next level by combining it with a kind of more holistic view of the mixing process. So recently I sat down and I watched 100 mixing tip videos in a single day. I basically watched every single video on YouTube that is a mixing tip video, and there were a lot of things that they all said, so it was a really good way to identify kind of where everyone agrees. There are a few things that were totally different in every video, and there was one thing that not a single person spoke about. So if you want to watch that video, click on screen now, you can see that there, and I'll see you in that video.